The cocking of a revolver echoed through the dusty plains of Durango, Colorado, as Margaret Foster stood her ground against the man who had tormented her family for years. It was 1878, and at 22 years old, she never imagined she would be caught between her father's desperate promise and the love that had unexpectedly bloomed in her heart like a desert flower after rain. "Your pa gave me his word, girl," Silas Jenkins snarled, his weathered face twisting into an ugly grin. His reputation for cruelty was well earned, the scars on his knuckles testament to the violence he'd inflicted on those who crossed him. "You'll be my wife come Sunday, whether you like it or not." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her chin high. "My father doesn't own me, Mr. Jenkins. I'm not cattle to be traded." The older man stepped closer, the smell of whiskey and tobacco on his breath making her stomach turn. At 45, Jenkins was more than twice her age, and the thought of being bound to him made her blood run cold. He'd been their neighbor for as long as she could remember, his prosperous ranch bordering their struggling homestead, and he'd watched her grow with calculating eyes. "Your pa's in debt to me up to his eyeballs. This marriage is the only thing keeping your family on that worthless patch of land." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist so tight she feared it might snap. "Besides, no one else will have you now that words out your promise to me." A shadow moved behind Jenkins, and Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the tall silhouette. "Take your hands off her." The voice was steady, deadly calm, and belonged to Hayes O'Malley, the cowboy who had ridden into Durango 6 months ago and changed everything. Jenkins turned slowly, his grip loosening enough for Margaret to pull away. "This ain't your business, O'Malley. The girl's spoken for." Hayes stepped into the light of the setting sun, his lean frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. At 26, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen too much too young. His dark hair fell in waves beneath his hat, and his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, never left Jenkins. "Seems to me the lady hasn't done any speaking on the matter." Hayes's hand hovered near his holster, not threatening but ready. "Why don't we let her decide?" Jenkins spat on the ground between them. "Her father already decided. We shook on it." Margaret felt a surge of courage as Hayes stood his ground. They had shared secret moments over the past month's conversations by the creek, a brush of hands as he helped her onto her horse, a stolen kiss behind the general store that had set her soul aflame. He had come to town as a hired hand for the Anderson spread, but had quickly proven himself to be more than just another drifter. "My father was desperate," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He thought he had no choice, but I do." Jenkins's face darkened. "Your pa owes me enough to lose that farm 3 times over. You think this saddle tramp can save you from that?" "I can save myself," Margaret replied, though her eyes darted to Hayes, seeking the reassurance she found in his steady gaze. Hayes stepped between them. "Jenkins, there are other ways to settle debts that don't involve forcing a woman to marry against her will." The older man laughed, a harsh sound that scraped against the evening air. "Like what? You gonna pay off their debt? With what money? You're nothing but a hired gun with dirt for prospects." Margaret saw Hayes's jaw tighten, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he turned to her, his voice softening. "Margaret, no one can promise you to anyone without your consent. Not your father, not this man, not me." He held out his hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. "But I'm asking you, here and now, promise yourself to me. Choose for yourself." Time seemed to still as Margaret looked between the 2 men, Jenkins with his wealth and land built on intimidation and cruelty, and Hayes, who had nothing to offer but his heart and the promise of freedom. "I choose Hayes," she said, the words escaping her like birds finally freed from a cage. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his calloused palm against hers, Jenkins's face contorted with rage. "This isn't over. Your father signed papers. We had an agreement." "An agreement made under duress isn't binding, Jenkins," Hayes replied. "Not in any court that matters." "You think I need a court?" Jenkins reached for his gun, but Hayes was faster, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. "I don't want bloodshed," Hayes said evenly. "But I will protect what's mine." Jenkins hesitated, calculating his odds against Hayes's reputation with a gun. Finally, he lowered his hand. This ain't over, not by a long shot. He backed away, mounting his horse with stiff movements. I'll be seeing your father, Miss Foster. And you'll regret this decision. As Jenkins rode away, the dust settling in his wake, Margaret turned to Hayes, her heart racing with fear and exhilaration. What have we done? Hayes holstered his gun and took both her hands in his. We've made a choice, together. His eyes searched hers. Do you regret it already? She shook her head, strands of her auburn hair catching the last light of day. No, but my father, he'll be furious. And Jenkins won't forgive this slight. We'll face it together, Hayes promised, his thumb gently stroking the inside of her wrist where Jenkins's grip had left angry red marks. I won't let him hurt you or your family. How? Margaret asked. My father's debt is real, Hayes. Jenkins holds the papers. He could take our farm tomorrow if he wanted. Hayes nodded, his expression solemn. I've been saving, working extra jobs. It's not enough to clear the debt, but it's a start, and I know people in these parts now, good people who might help. Margaret leaned into him, allowing herself to draw strength from his solid presence. I need to go home. I need to tell my father what's happened. I'll come with you, Hayes said, helping her onto her horse before mounting his own. As they rode toward the Foster homestead, the setting sun casting long shadows across the Colorado landscape, Margaret knew they were riding into a storm. But for the first time in months, since her father had come home drunk and announced he'd found a solution to their financial troubles, she felt a flicker of hope. The small farmhouse came into view, smoke curling from the chimney against the darkening sky. Margaret's younger brother, Daniel, was chopping wood by the barn, and he stopped mid-swing when he saw them approach. Maggie, he called, confusion clouding his 15-year-old face as he spotted Hayes. Pa's been asking where you went. He's in a state. Margaret dismounted, handing the reins to Daniel. Is he drinking? Daniel nodded grimly. Since noon, Jenkins was here earlier. They argued something fierce. Hayes dismounted as well, his expression grave. Stay out here with your brother, he told Margaret. Let me talk to him first. No, Margaret said firmly. This is my fight too. We'll face him together. The front door opened before they reached it, and Thomas Foster appeared, silhouetted in the doorway. He swayed slightly, a bottle dangling from his fingers. What's he doing here? He demanded, pointing at Hayes with the bottle. And where in tarnation have you been, girl? Jenkins was just here saying you're causing trouble. Margaret squared her shoulders. I'm not marrying Mr. Jenkins, Pa, I won't. Her father's face flushed with anger. The hell you won't. I gave my word. It wasn't your word to give, Hayes said quietly. Margaret is a grown woman, not property to be bartered. Thomas Foster stepped onto the porch, his eyes narrowing as he focused on Hayes. This you're doing, you turning my daughter against me. He stumbled forward. I got debts, O'Malley, debts I can't pay any other way. You know what Jenkins will do if I can't make good on what I owe. We can find another way, Margaret pleaded. There must be something else we can sell. Her father laughed bitterly. What do you think I've been doing? We've got nothing left to sell. The cattle are gone, the good horses too. This drought's taken everything else. He took another swig from his bottle. Jenkins offered a fair trade, the debt forgiven for your hand. It's more than fair, considering. Fair, Hayes's voice hardened. There's nothing fair about forcing your daughter to marry a man like Jenkins. You know what he did to his last wife. Thomas Foster's expression faltered. Jenkins's previous wife had died under mysterious circumstances 2 years prior. The official story was a fall from a horse, but whispers around town told a different tale. That was never proven, Foster muttered, but the doubt in his voice was clear. Pa, Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle now. I know you're scared, I know you're trying to protect our home. But there has to be another way. Her father sank down onto the porch steps, suddenly looking every day of his 50 years and more. There isn't, Maggie. I've tried, I've begged for extensions, for mercy. Jenkins wants the land, has for years, but he wants you more. He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot. At least as his wife, you'd be provided for, you and Daniel both. And what kind of life would that be for her? Hayes asked, sitting down beside the older man. living in fear, belonging to a man who sees her as property he purchased with your debt. Foster's shoulders slumped. What's your plan then, cowboy? You gonna marry my daughter instead? Give her what kind of life? You've got nothing. I have enough, Hayes replied. I've saved almost every dollar I've earned these past few years. I was planning to buy land of my own come spring. Margaret looked at him in surprise. This was news to her. They had spoken of dreams and futures, but never in such concrete terms. I love your daughter, sir, Hayes continued, and I'll work until my hands bleed to give her the life she deserves. But I won't stand by and let her be traded to a man like Jenkins. Foster looked between them, seeing for the first time the way they stood together united. You love him, Maggie, Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I do, Pa, with all my heart. Her father sighed deeply, setting the bottle aside. Jenkins will come for the farm, he'll take everything. Then we'll rebuild, Margaret said firmly, somewhere else if we have to, together. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the evening air, and they all turned to see a group of riders coming toward the farm. Jenkins was at the lead, flanked by 3 of his ranch hands. Speak of the devil, Foster muttered, rising unsteadily to his feet. Hayes moved protectively in front of Margaret. Daniel, he called to the boy who had been watching from near the barn, get inside and fetch your pa's shotgun, just in case. The boy nodded and ran into the house as Jenkins and his men pulled up in front of the porch. Evening, Foster, Jenkins called, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Thought I'd stop by again, seeing as your daughter seems confused about her obligations. Thomas Foster straightened, something of his former strength returning to his bearing. My daughter isn't confused about anything, Jenkins, and neither am I, not anymore. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. We had a deal, Foster, papers signed and everything. A deal made under duress, Hayes said, echoing his words from earlier, with terms no decent man would accept. Jenkins laughed, a cold sound in the gathering dusk. Decent, that's rich coming from a drifter. Tell me, O'Malley, how many men have you killed? Word is you've got quite the reputation from Texas to Wyoming. Margaret glanced at Hayes, seeing the tension in his jaw. There were parts of his past he rarely spoke of, shadows that sometimes clouded his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. That's all behind me, Hayes said evenly, but I remember how to handle men like you. Jenkins dismounted, his men following suit. I want what's owed to me, Foster. Either the girl or the land, your choice. Daniel emerged from the house, carrying his father's shotgun. He positioned himself on the porch, his young face set with determination despite the fear in his eyes. Thomas Foster looked at his children, then at Hayes, and finally at Jenkins. The debt is real, he acknowledged. But I was wrong to try to pay it with my daughter's future. I'm willing to sign over the farm to clear what I owe, but Margaret makes her own choices now. Jenkins spat on the ground. That wasn't our arrangement. It's the only one you're getting, Foster replied, his voice steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. For a long moment, Jenkins stared at them, calculation in his cold eyes. Then he smiled, a smile that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Fine, I'll take the land, be out by noon tomorrow. Margaret stepped forward. Wait, the farm is worth more than what my father owes. You should pay the difference. Jenkins laughed. You've got spirit, girl, I'll give you that, but you're in no position to negotiate. She's right, Hayes said. The law would say the same. If you're taking the land for the debt, you owe them the difference in fair value. One of Jenkins's men shifted uncomfortably. He's right, boss. Sheriff Miller wouldn't look kindly on you taking the whole spread for what Foster owes. Jenkins glared at his man, then back at the group on the porch. I'll have my lawyer draw up papers. You'll get whatever's fair minus what I'm owed. He mounted his horse again. Noon tomorrow, Foster, not a minute later. As Jenkins and his men rode away, Margaret felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. Their home, the only one she'd ever known, would be gone by this time tomorrow. Her father sat heavily on the porch steps. I'm sorry, children, I've failed you. Daniel sat beside him, the shotgun across his knees. Where will we go, Pa? Margaret looked at Hayes, who had been quiet since Jenkins left. Hayes, he turned to her, his expression determined. I have a place in mind. It's not much, but it could be a start for all of us. Thomas Foster looked up. What place? There's a small cabin and some land about 10 miles north of town, Hayes explained. Belongs to old man Wilson. He's heading back east to live with his daughter and looking to sell. It's rough, needs work, but the price is fair. How do you know about this? Margaret asked. Hayes smiled slightly. I've been asking around ever since. He hesitated. Ever since I knew I wanted to make a life with you if you'd have me. Margaret's heart swelled even as uncertainty clouded her thoughts. But would there be room for all of us? Hayes nodded. It's small, but we could add on. The land is good better than this, with access to the creek year-round. No drought would hit it as hard as it's hit here. Thomas Foster looked skeptical. And how would we pay for this paradise? With my savings, Hayes said simply. And whatever fair payment Jenkins gives you for this place, between us it should be enough for a new start. Margaret saw hope flicker in her father's eyes, quickly replaced by shame. I can't take your savings, son. Not after I nearly sold my own daughter to save my pride. Hayes knelt in front of the older man. You were desperate, sir. Fear makes men do things they wouldn't otherwise consider, but now we have a chance to start fresh. Together, as a family, if you'll have me. Foster looked at his daughter, seeing the love in her eyes as she gazed at Hayes. You really love him, Maggie. More than I can say, she answered softly. Her father nodded slowly. Then I reckon we should see this cabin of Wilson's come morning. He looked at Hayes. But I'll work to pay you back every cent, you hear me? Hayes smiled, relief washing over his features. Yes, sir. That night, as the Foster family and Hayes made plans for the move, Margaret slipped outside to the old swing her father had hung from the oak tree when she was a child. Hayes found her there staring up at the stars. Having second thoughts, he asked, sitting beside her on the wooden seat. She shook her head. No, just saying goodbye. I've never lived anywhere else. Hayes took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. It won't be easy. Wilson's place is rough. I'm not afraid of hard work, she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. I know you're not, he chuckled softly. It's one of the many reasons I love you. Margaret lifted her head to look at him. When did you know that you loved me, I mean? Hayes thought for a moment. Do you remember that day at the creek when you were teaching Daniel to fish and you fell in trying to net that trout? She groaned. I was soaking wet and covered in mud. And laughing, Hayes added. Your hair was plastered to your face, your dress was ruined, and you were laughing like it was the greatest adventure of your life. His voice softened. That's when I knew I wanted to hear that laugh every day for the rest of my days. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Even though I looked a fright, you've never looked more beautiful, he assured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. What about you? When did you know? The spring dance, she answered without hesitation. When you danced with old Mrs. Thornton because no one else would ask her. You treated her like she was the belle of the ball, and she smiled for the first time since Mr. Thornton passed. Hayes looked surprised. That's what did it, not my dashing good looks or my way with horses, Margaret laughed softly. Those didn't hurt, but no, it was your kindness. That's rarer than gold out here. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. I meant what I said to Jenkins. I will protect you, Margaret, you and your family. I know, she whispered, but I worry about what he might do. He's not a man who forgives easily. Hayes's expression turned serious. No, he's not, which is why we need to be careful until we're settled at Wilson's place. Jenkins will be watching for any chance to cause trouble. Margaret nodded, the reality of their situation dampening the moment's sweetness. We should go back in. Tomorrow we'll come early. Hayes stood, offering her his hand. As they walked back to the house, Margaret couldn't help glancing over her shoulder at the darkness beyond the farm's boundaries, wondering if Jenkins's eyes were out there, watching and waiting. Morning came with a flurry of activity as the Foster family packed what they could into their wagon. The furniture would have to stay, there wasn't room, and besides, Jenkins had made it clear the house was to be left intact. But clothes, tools, family heirlooms, and whatever food they could transport were loaded carefully. Hayes had ridden out at dawn to speak with Wilson, confirming that the old man was still willing to sell and arranging to meet him in town later to discuss terms. He returned as they were finishing the loading, his expression cautiously optimistic. Wilson's agreeable, he reported. Says he's been hoping someone decent would take the place. He'll meet us at the bank at 2 o'clock. Margaret nodded, relief washing over her. And Jenkins, any sign of him? None yet, Hayes replied, but it's not yet noon. As if summoned by his name, the sound of approaching riders reached them. Jenkins appeared on the road, this time with only one companion, his lawyer, Mr. Peterson, a thin man with spectacles who seemed perpetually uncomfortable in Jenkins's presence. Thomas Foster stepped forward as the men dismounted. "You're early, Jenkins." "Eager to see the back of you, Foster," Jenkins replied with a cold smile. His eyes swept over the loaded wagon, then to Margaret, and finally to Hayes. "Leaving something behind for the next occupants, I hope?" "The house is intact as agreed," Foster said stiffly, "with all the furnishings." Peterson cleared his throat, producing a sheaf of papers from his satchel. "I have the documents here, Mr. Foster, the transfer of deed and a bank draft for the difference between your debt and the assessed value of the property." Foster took the papers, scanning them carefully before passing them to Hayes, who did the same with a more practiced eye. "The amount seems light," Hayes commented, looking up at Peterson. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Jenkins had the property assessed yesterday afternoon. Given the state of the land after the drought and the condition of the fencing and outbuildings, this was deemed fair market value." Hayes handed the papers back to Foster. "It's less than it's worth, but it's legal enough. The decision is yours, sir." Foster looked at the amount on the bank draft, then at his children. It wasn't much, but combined with Hayes's savings, it might just be enough for a fresh start. "I'll sign." Peterson provided a pen, and Foster signed where indicated, his hand steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Jenkins signed as well, a satisfied smirk playing at his lips. "The property is now mine," Jenkins announced, taking the deed Peterson handed him. "I trust you'll be on your way promptly." "We were just leaving," Margaret said, her voice cool despite the anger simmering beneath. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. "A shame things worked out this way, Miss Foster. You would have had a much more comfortable life as my wife." Hayes stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "That's enough, Jenkins. You've got what you wanted." Jenkins laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Not everything I wanted, O'Malley, not yet." He mounted his horse, looking down at them with contempt. "Enjoy your new life together, however long it lasts." With that ominous parting, Jenkins and Peterson rode toward the farmhouse, leaving the Foster family and Hayes standing beside their loaded wagon. "We should go," Hayes said quietly. "Wilson is expecting us, and we need to see the banker before he meets with us." They climbed onto the wagon, Daniel riding beside Hayes on the bench while Margaret and her father sat among their possessions in the back. As they pulled away, Margaret couldn't help looking back at the only home she'd ever known, now belonging to the man who had tried to claim her as well. Durango was busy when they arrived, the main street crowded with wagons and riders. They made their way to the bank first, where Foster deposited Jenkins's payment and arranged for it to be available for their meeting with Wilson. "We have a couple of hours before Wilson expects us," Hayes said as they emerged from the bank. "We should get something to eat and rest a bit." They found a quiet corner in the town's small cafe, ordering a simple meal. Margaret noticed Hayes was distracted, his eyes constantly moving to the door and windows. "You're worried," she said softly. He nodded slightly. "Jenkins made a threat back there, not directly, but clear enough. I don't trust him to just let this go." Foster, who had been listening, leaned forward. "You think he might try something here in town?" "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "But I think we should be careful until we're settled at Wilson's place, and even then we should watch our backs for a while." Daniel, who at 15 was eager to prove his manhood, straightened. "I can help keep watch. I'm a good shot." Hayes smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. "You are, and we'll need that, but let's hope it doesn't come to shooting." After their meal, they made their way to Wilson's small house on the edge of town. The old man was waiting for them on his porch, his weathered face breaking into a smile as they approached. "Right on time," he called, standing with the help of a cane. Come in, we can talk inside." Wilson's house was neat but sparse, much of his belongings already packed for his journey east. He ushered them to a table where a map was spread out. "This here's the property," he explained, his gnarled finger tracing the boundaries. 20 acres with the cabin here near the creek. Good water year-round and the soil's rich enough for growing just about anything that'll take in this climate. Hayes studied the map carefully. "And the cabin, how big is it?" Wilson scratched his beard. "2 rooms now, but I built it to be expanded. Foundations solid, roofs new as of last spring. It'll need work to house all of you comfortably, but the bones are good." "Can we see it today?" Margaret asked, hope creeping into her voice. Wilson nodded. "That's the plan. I figured you'd want to look it over before making any decisions. We can ride out after we settle the business part." The negotiations were straightforward. Wilson named his price, which was fair, and Hayes countered with a slightly lower offer that included help loading Wilson's belongings for his journey east. The old man accepted with a handshake, and papers were drawn up and signed on the spot. "It's yours," Wilson said, handing the deed to Hayes. "May it bring you as many good years as it brought me." The journey to the property took less than an hour. As they crested a small rise, the cabin came into view, nestled among a stand of pines near a clear creek. It was small, as Wilson had warned, but solidly built. A small corral stood nearby, and the remnants of a vegetable garden could be seen behind the cabin. Margaret felt her heart lift at the sight. It wasn't the farm she'd grown up on, but something about the little homestead spoke of possibility. Wilson gave them a tour, pointing out the cabin's features and the property's boundaries. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a smaller bedroom off to one side. A root cellar had been dug beneath the cabin, accessible through a trapdoor in the floor. "It'll be tight with 4 of you," Wilson acknowledged as they stood in the main room. "But there's plenty of good timber on the property for expanding." Hayes was already measuring with his eyes. "We could add another room here," he said, indicating the western wall, "and maybe a loft above for Daniel." The boy brightened at the prospect of his own space. "Could I help build it?" "Couldn't do it without you," Hayes assured him. Thomas Foster had been quiet during the tour, but now he spoke up. "The land looks good for cattle, better than what we had." Wilson nodded. "It is. I ran a small herd for years before I got too old for it. The grazing's good, and the creek doesn't dry up even in the worst summers." As the men discussed the possibilities for livestock, Margaret wandered outside. The afternoon sun filtered through the pines, casting dappled shadows on the ground. She walked to the edge of the creek, listening to the water's gentle murmur. "What do you think?" Hayes asked, coming up behind her. She turned, smiling. "I think it's perfect." Relief washed over his features. "Really, it's much smaller than your father's farm, but it's ours," she said simply. "And it feels, I don't know, peaceful, like we could be happy here." Hayes took her hands in his. "We will be, I promise you that." Wilson agreed to stay in town for another week while the Fosters and Hayes moved in and got settled. They returned to town to arrange for the wagon to be unloaded at the cabin the next day, and for supplies they would need immediately. As evening fell, they took rooms at the modest hotel in Durango, one for Foster and Daniel, and another for Hayes. Margaret would stay with a friend who lived in town, the school teacher, Miss Abernathy, who had offered her spare room when she heard of the family's situation. Hayes walked Margaret to the school teacher's house, the streets of Durango growing quiet as businesses closed for the day. "Will you be all right here?" he asked as they reached Miss Abernathy's neat cottage. Margaret nodded. "Charlotte and I have been friends since school days. I'll be fine." She hesitated. "What about you? Will you watch for Jenkins?" Hayes's expression turned serious. "I will. But I don't think he'll try anything in town. Too many witnesses. And tomorrow, when we're at the cabin, we'll be careful," he promised. "Daniel and your father will keep watch while I work on securing the place. It's defensible." Wilson chose the spot well. Margaret felt a chill despite the warm evening. "I hate that we have to think this way, that we have to worry about being attacked in our new home." Hayes drew her into his arms, his chin resting on top of her head. "It won't be forever. Jenkins will realize eventually that he can't win this fight. Men like him move on to easier targets when they're thwarted." "I hope you're right," she whispered against his chest. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "In the meantime, we have a future to build together. The word sent warmth spreading through her. Together, she repeated. Hayes glanced at Miss Abernathy's window, where a curtain had twitched suspiciously. I should go before your friend comes out with a broom to chase me off her porch, Margaret laughed. Charlotte isn't that bad, she just believes in propriety. As do I, Hayes said with mock seriousness. Which is why I should tell you that as soon as we're settled, I plan to speak to your father formally about our future. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. You mean? I mean that I want to marry you, Margaret Foster, properly with your father's blessing and a preacher and everything. His eyes searched hers. If you'll have me. Yes, she breathed without hesitation. Yes, I will. The door opened behind them, and Miss Abernathy appeared, her thin face composed in an expression of polite inquiry. Margaret, is everything all right? Everything is perfect, Charlotte, Margaret replied, her eyes still on Hayes. Mr. O'Malley was just saying good night. Hayes tipped his hat to the schoolteacher. Madam, thank you for giving Miss Foster a place to stay tonight. Charlotte Abernathy nodded primly. You're welcome, Mr. O'Malley, though I do think it's time for Margaret to come inside now. The hour grows late. Of course, Hayes agreed. He squeezed Margaret's hand once more before releasing it. Until tomorrow. As Margaret followed Charlotte inside, she couldn't help looking back at Hayes walking away, his tall figure silhouetted against the lamplight of the street. Despite all the uncertainty they faced, her heart was full of hope. Charlotte closed the door and turned to her with raised eyebrows. Well, it seems there have been developments since I last saw you. Margaret felt a blush creep into her cheeks. It's been an eventful few days. So I've heard, Charlotte replied, leading the way to the small parlor. The whole town is talking about how you defied Silas Jenkins and your father's arrangement. Margaret sank onto the sofa. I couldn't go through with it, Charlotte, not even to save the farm. Charlotte sat beside her, her expression softening. No one blames you, dear, Jenkins is. Well, there are rumors about what happened to his first wife. They're probably true, Margaret said quietly. The man is cruel, I've seen it. And this Mr. O'Malley, Charlotte asked, changing the subject. He seems quite taken with you. Margaret couldn't suppress her smile. We're going to be married, once we're settled at our new place. Married, Charlotte exclaimed. My goodness, things have moved quickly. Are you certain, Margaret, you haven't known him very long? Long enough to know my heart, Margaret replied with conviction. Hayes is a good man, Charlotte. The best I've ever known. Charlotte studied her friend's face, then nodded slowly. Well, you've always had good judgment, better than most. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Now you must be exhausted. Let me show you to your room, and then I insist you tell me everything over a cup of tea. The night passed peacefully, but Margaret slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of Jenkins's cold eyes and her father's defeated expression. She woke early, helping Charlotte prepare breakfast as they waited for Hayes to arrive. He came just after sunrise, looking tired but alert. Everything's ready, he reported as Charlotte served him coffee. Your father and Daniel are loading the last of the supplies we bought yesterday. We should be able to leave within the hour. Any sign of trouble? Margaret asked quietly while Charlotte busied herself in the kitchen. Hayes shook his head. None. Jenkins was seen heading back to his ranch, your father's farm, now last evening. Hasn't been in town since. Margaret relaxed slightly. That's good news, isn't it? It is, Hayes agreed, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. They left town as the businesses were opening, the wagon loaded with their belongings and additional supplies purchased with some of the money from Jenkins's payment. Wilson had ridden ahead to meet them at the cabin, wanting to show them a few more things about the property before he departed. The journey was uneventful, the bright morning sun warming their backs as they followed the trail north. Margaret rode beside the wagon on a horse borrowed from the livery, enjoying the freedom of movement after the tension of the past days. They arrived at the cabin to find Wilson waiting, his mule tethered nearby. The old man had built a fire in the hearth and was brewing coffee when they entered. Thought you might need this after the ride, he said, pouring the strong brew into cups for each of them. The day was spent unloading the wagon and arranging their belongings in the small cabin. Hayes and Daniel began assessing what would be needed for the expansion, while Thomas Foster explored the property more thoroughly with Wilson, discussing the potential for raising cattle again. By late afternoon, Wilson was ready to leave. "I'll be in town another 5 days if you need anything," he told Hayes as they stood by the old man's mule. "After that, I'll be heading east. My daughter's expecting me by the end of the month." Hayes shook the old man's hand. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Wilson. We'll take good care of the place." Wilson nodded, his eyes moving to where Margaret was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 pines. "She seems like a fine young woman." "The finest," Hayes agreed. The old man chuckled. "Then don't waste time, son. Life's too short for waiting when you know what you want." He mounted his mule with surprising agility for his age. "Good luck to you all." As Wilson rode away, Hayes rejoined the others at the cabin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across their new property. "We should secure everything for the night," he suggested. "Check the windows and doors." Thomas Foster nodded in agreement. "I'll take first watch. You and Daniel get some rest." Inside the cabin, Margaret had arranged their bedding as best she could. Her father would sleep in the main room near the fireplace, Daniel on a pallet in the corner, and Hayes had insisted on sleeping outside to keep watch despite Foster's offer to take the first shift. Margaret herself would take the small bedroom, though she felt guilty having the only proper bed. "I should sleep out here," she argued. "Daniel could have the bedroom." "Absolutely not," her father said firmly. "You take the bedroom. It's only temporary until we can add on to the place." Hayes had already begun making plans for the expansion, sketching ideas on a scrap of paper as they ate a simple dinner by the fire. "We can start on the new room tomorrow," he said. "There's plenty of good timber on the property. Daniel and I can fell some trees in the morning." "I'll help too," Foster insisted. 3 pairs of hands will make the work go faster." As darkness fell completely, Hayes stepped outside to scan the perimeter of their small homestead. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. The creek gurgled softly nearby, and nocturnal creatures rustled in the underbrush. He checked his revolver, ensuring it was loaded and ready, then positioned himself on the small porch where he had a clear view of the approach to the cabin. Inside, he could hear Margaret moving about, preparing for bed. The thought of her so near, yet properly separated by walls and conventions, both comforted and tortured him. They had spoken of marriage, but hadn't set a date. Hayes knew that the proper thing would be to wait until they were more established, until the cabin was expanded and they could offer Margaret a suitable home. But another part of him, the part that remembered Jenkins's threat, wanted to claim her as his wife as soon as possible. The cabin door opened softly and Margaret stepped out onto the porch. She had changed into a simple nightdress, covered with a shawl against the evening chill. "You should be inside," Hayes said gently. "It's getting cold out here." "I wanted to see you before I went to sleep," she replied, moving to sit beside him on the rough bench Wilson had built along the porch wall. "To thank you for everything you've done for us." Hayes shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I did it as much for myself as for you and your family." "Still," she insisted, "not many men would have stood up to Jenkins the way you did, or offered to share their savings to give a family a new start." "Not many men are in love with Margaret Foster," he countered with a smile. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "When should we marry?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "I thought, that is, I assumed you'd want to wait until the cabin is expanded, until we're more settled." Margaret shook her head slightly. "I don't want to wait, not with Jenkins's threats hanging over us, not when I know what I want." Hayes's heart raced at her words. "What about your father? He might prefer we wait." "My father gave up the right to dictate my future when he tried to trade me to Jenkins," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "Besides, he likes you. He can see how much you care for me." Hayes turned to face her fully. "Margaret Foster, are you proposing to me?" She laughed softly. "I suppose I am. Is that terribly forward of me?" "Terribly," he agreed with mock seriousness, "but I accept nonetheless." He took her hands in his. "We could ride into town tomorrow. There's a preacher there who could marry us." "What about the expansion? The trees you were going to fell?" "They'll still be standing the day after tomorrow," he replied. "Some things are more important." Margaret's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then yes, tomorrow." The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Hayes was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his gun. "Inside," he ordered Margaret. "Wake your father and stay away from the windows." She hesitated only a moment before obeying, slipping through the door as Hayes moved to the edge of the porch, using one of the support posts as cover. The riders emerged from the darkness, 3 men, moving slowly but purposefully toward the cabin. Hayes recognized the lead figure immediately, Silas Jenkins. The cabin door opened behind him and Thomas Foster stepped out, shotgun in hand. "Trouble?" he asked quietly. "Jenkins," Hayes replied grimly, "and 2 of his men." Foster moved to stand beside him, his expression hardening as he recognized the approaching riders. "What do you think he wants?" "Nothing good," Hayes said. "Keep Daniel and Margaret inside." Jenkins pulled up about 20 yards from the cabin, his men flanking him. "Evening, O'Malley," he called. "Foster, nice little place you've got here." "What do you want, Jenkins?" Hayes demanded, not lowering his gun. Jenkins spread his hands in a gesture of false innocence. "Just being neighborly, thought I'd check in on how you're settling into old Wilson's place." His smile was cold in the moonlight. "Bit small for 4 people, isn't it?" "We manage," Foster replied tersely. "Now state your business or move on," Jenkins chuckled. "Always so direct, Foster. Fine then, I've come with an offer." He reached into his jacket and produced a piece of paper. "I've had my lawyer draw up a new agreement. I'm willing to trade back the Foster farm for this property." Hayes and Foster exchanged confused glances. "Why would you want this place over the Foster farm?" Hayes asked suspiciously. "The farm is 3 times the size with established fields." Jenkins's smile widened. "Let's just say I've recently acquired some information about this particular piece of land that makes it valuable to me." Understanding dawned on Hayes. "Gold. You think there's gold on this property?" Jenkins's expression confirmed it before he could reply. Wilson was always secretive about why he chose this particular spot. Always had enough money despite never running more than a few head of cattle. I had my suspicions, but couldn't confirm them until recently. "So you want us to trade this place for the Foster farm?" Foster asked incredulously. "Why would we do that when we could work the gold ourselves if it exists?" "Because you don't know where to look," Jenkins replied smoothly. "And because I'm not asking." His hand moved to his gun. "I'm telling." Hayes's grip tightened on his revolver. 3 against 2 aren't great odds, Jenkins. "Even if you win, you'll lose at least 1 man, maybe more." "You're forgetting something, O'Malley," Jenkins replied. "I know you've got the girl and the boy in that cabin, 1 stray bullet through those thin walls." He let the threat hang in the air. Foster's face paled, but Hayes kept his expression neutral. "If you think I'll let you anywhere near this cabin while they're inside, you're mistaken." The standoff stretched for several tense moments, neither side willing to back down. Then, unexpectedly, the cabin door opened again. Margaret stepped out, a rifle in her hands. "Margaret, get back inside," Hayes ordered without taking his eyes off Jenkins. She ignored him, moving to stand on his other side. "No, I'm tired of hiding while men decide my fate," Jenkins laughed. "Well, isn't this touching? The whole family ready to die together." "We're not dying today," Margaret replied steadily, raising the rifle to her shoulder. "And we're not giving up our home, not again." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty of it, seemed to give Jenkins pause. He studied the 3 figures on the porch, all armed and clearly willing to fight. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "That gold is there. Wilson's been working a small vein for years." "If it exists, we'll find it ourselves," Hayes replied. "Now ride out, Jenkins." "This is your only warning." Jenkins's face darkened with anger. "This isn't over, O'Malley, not by a long shot." He wheeled his horse around. "You can't stay awake forever. Sooner or later, you'll let your guard down, and when you do." With that, he and his men rode back into the darkness, the sound of their horses fading gradually into the night. No one on the porch moved for several long moments, straining to ensure the riders had truly departed. Finally, Hayes lowered his gun slightly. "Daniel," he called softly. "You can come out now." The door opened once more and Daniel emerged, his father's old pistol clutched in his hand. "Are they gone?" "For now," Hayes confirmed, "but they'll be back." Foster ran a hand through his thinning hair. Do you think he was telling the truth about gold on the property? Hayes shook his head. I don't know, but if he believes it strongly enough to threaten us, he's not going to give up easily. Margaret lowered her rifle. What do we do now? Hayes thought for a moment. We stick to our plan. Tomorrow, you and I ride into town as we discussed. While we're there, we'll speak to the sheriff, let him know about Jenkins's threats. He turned to Foster. You and Daniel stay here, keep watch. We'll be back by nightfall. Foster nodded grimly. Be careful on the road. Jenkins might try to ambush you. We'll take the long way around, Hayes assured him. Through the high country where it's harder to set up an ambush. They spent the remainder of the night taking turns keeping watch, but Jenkins and his men didn't return. As dawn broke, Hayes and Margaret prepared to ride to town. Are you sure about this? Foster asked as they mounted their horses. About getting married today, I mean. It seems hasty. Margaret leaned down from her saddle to kiss her father's cheek. We're sure, Pa, with everything that's happening, it feels right to make it official. Foster looked at Hayes. You'll protect her no matter what, with my life, Hayes promised solemnly. Foster nodded, emotion clouding his eyes. Then you have my blessing, both of you. The ride to Durango took longer than expected, as Hayes insisted on taking the more circuitous mountain path to avoid any potential ambush. It was nearly noon when they finally rode into town. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where they found Sheriff Miller, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, cleaning his shotgun behind his desk. O'Malley, he greeted Hayes with a nod. Miss Foster, what brings you to town? Hayes explained the situation, Jenkins's threats, his claim about gold on the Wilson property, and their concerns about future trouble. Miller listened thoughtfully, his weathered face revealing little. When Hayes finished, the sheriff sighed deeply. Can't say I'm surprised. Jenkins has been pushing the boundaries of the law for years, but he's careful never leaves enough evidence for me to take action. He threatened us openly, Margaret pointed out, in front of witnesses. Your family and Hayes, Miller noted. Not exactly unbiased witnesses in the eyes of the law, Hayes leaned forward. So you're saying there's nothing you can do? Miller held up a hand. I didn't say that. I'll ride out to your place tomorrow, have a look around. If Jenkins shows up again while I'm there, well, that's a different story. He scratched his beard. In the meantime, you're right to be cautious. Jenkins isn't known for idle threats. Thank you, Sheriff, Hayes said, standing to leave. We appreciate anything you can do. As they stepped back onto the street, Margaret took Hayes's arm. What now? He smiled down at her, pushing aside his concerns about Jenkins for the moment. Now, Miss Foster, we find ourselves a preacher. The Reverend Thomas was available and agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon. While Hayes arranged for the minister, Margaret visited Charlotte Abernathy, explaining their plans and asking her friend to witness the marriage. Today, Charlotte exclaimed. My goodness, Margaret, this is all happening so quickly. I know, Margaret admitted. But with everything that's happened and Jenkins's threats, it feels right, Charlotte. Hayes and I don't want to wait. Charlotte studied her friend's face, then nodded decisively. Well then, you certainly can't get married in those traveling clothes. Come upstairs, I have a dress that might suit. An hour later, Margaret stood in Charlotte's spare room, hardly recognizing herself in the looking glass. The dress Charlotte had provided was simple but elegant pale blue with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her friend had arranged her hair as well, pinning it up with small white flowers from the garden. You look beautiful, Charlotte said, adjusting the flowers one final time. Mr. O'Malley won't know what hit him. Margaret smiled nervously. Do you think it's too much? We're just going to the minister's study, not a proper church wedding. Nonsense, Charlotte replied firmly. Every bride deserves to look her best on her wedding day, whether there are 2 witnesses or 200. She squeezed Margaret's hands. Are you ready? Margaret took a deep breath, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. I am. They walked the short distance to the minister's small church, where Hayes was waiting outside. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, as well his clothes were freshly brushed, his hair neatly combed, and he had shaved the stubble that usually shadowed his jaw. When he saw Margaret, he froze, his expression one of such open adoration that it made her heart swell. Margaret, he breathed, You look, I don't have the words. She smiled, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. You clean up rather well yourself, Mr. O'Malley. Charlotte cleared her throat pointedly. The Reverend is waiting inside, shall we? The ceremony was brief but meaningful, conducted in the minister's study with Charlotte and the church caretaker as witnesses. As they exchanged vows, Margaret was struck by the solemnity in Hayes's voice, the way his hands held hers with such gentle strength. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Thomas declared with a warm smile. You may kiss your bride, Mr. O'Malley. Hayes hesitated only a moment before drawing Margaret into his arms and kissing her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, she saw that his eyes were suspiciously bright as well. Mrs. O'Malley, he whispered, testing the name on his tongue. My wife. My husband, she replied, the words filling her with a sense of rightness and completion. After thanking the Reverend and Charlotte, they decided to visit the general store to purchase a few items they hadn't thought to get the day before. As they walked down the main street, Hayes kept Margaret's hand tucked in the crook of his arm, and she could feel his thumb occasionally brushing over her wedding ring as if to reassure himself it was real. We should head back soon, he said as they exited the store with their purchases. I don't like leaving your father and Daniel alone too long with Jenkins out there. Margaret nodded in agreement, though part of her wished they could stay in town longer, savoring this brief bubble of happiness before returning to the reality of their situation. Do you think the sheriff will really help? Hayes's expression turned serious. I hope so. Miller's a good man, generally speaking, but Jenkins has influence in the county. Money talks even to lawmen sometimes. Then we'll have to be prepared to protect ourselves, Margaret said with determination. All of us together. Hayes smiled down at her, pride evident in his gaze. You're quite the frontier wife already, Mrs. O'Malley. They collected their horses from the livery and began the journey home, taking the longer route through the high country again, despite the advancing hour. The sun was beginning to set as they finally approached the cabin, casting long shadows across the clearing. As they drew closer, Hayes suddenly reined his horse to a stop, his hand going to his gun. Something's wrong. Margaret followed his gaze. The cabin door was open, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of Daniel or her father. Stay here, Hayes ordered, dismounting and drawing his revolver. No, Margaret replied firmly, sliding down from her own horse. Together, remember, he hesitated, then nodded tersely. Stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run, no arguments. They approached cautiously, Hayes leading the way with his gun at the ready. The cabin appeared deserted, their belongings scattered as if someone had searched through them hurriedly. Pa, Margaret called, her voice tight with fear. Daniel, no answer came from within the cabin. Hayes gestured for her to stay back as he entered first, checking each corner before beckoning her inside. They're not here, he said, his expression grave, but there was a struggle. Look. One of the chairs was overturned and there was a small bloodstain on the floor near the fireplace. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, do you think Jenkins? Don't jump to conclusions yet, Hayes interrupted, though his own face was taut with concern. Let's check outside. They searched the immediate area around the cabin, calling for Foster and Daniel. As they neared the creek, Hayes suddenly stopped, kneeling to examine something on the ground. Tracks, he said. Several horses and 2 people walking, one limping, judging by the stride. Pa and Daniel, Margaret asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. Hayes nodded grimly. Most likely. Being led away at gunpoint, I'd guess. Margaret felt sick with fear. Where would Jenkins take them? Back to his place, probably. Hayes stood, his expression hardening. He wants us to come after them. It's a trap. Then we have to spring it, Margaret said without hesitation. We can't leave them with that man. Hayes ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. We need a plan. Running in blindly will just get us all killed. He looked at the setting sun. It'll be dark soon. That might work to our advantage. They returned to the cabin to gather supplies and weapons. Hayes moved with the efficiency of a man who had faced danger before, checking ammunition and securing their horses. We'll circle around to the back of Jenkins's property, he explained as they worked. There's a ridge overlooking the main house where we can observe without being seen. Margaret nodded, trying to focus on the tasks at hand rather than the terrifying possibilities of what might be happening to her father and brother. What if they're not at the main house? The property is large. Then we keep looking, Hayes replied simply, but Jenkins is arrogant. He'll want them close where he can gloat. As they prepared to leave, Hayes pulled Margaret into his arms, holding her tightly for a moment. "This isn't exactly how I imagined our wedding night," he murmured against her hair. Despite everything, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. "We'll have time for that later, when everyone is safe." He pulled back to look into her eyes. "Yes, we will, I promise you that." The ride to the Foster farm, now Jenkins's property, took nearly 2 hours at a careful pace, avoiding the main trails. Night had fallen completely by the time they reached the ridge Hayes had mentioned, giving them a view down to the main house and outbuildings. Lights burned in the windows of the farmhouse, and several horses were tied up outside. Jenkins's men could be seen moving about, some standing guard around the perimeter. "There," Hayes whispered, pointing to one of the outbuildings, the old tool shed. "2 guards outside. That's not normal unless they're watching something important." Margaret squinted through the darkness. "You think that's where they're keeping Pa and Daniel? It makes sense. It's secure, away from the main house in case of trouble." Hayes studied the layout carefully. "The guards change every couple of hours. If Jenkins keeps to his usual routine, we need to wait for the right moment." They settled in to watch, the night air growing colder around them. Hayes removed his jacket and placed it around Margaret's shoulders despite her protests. "My new bride isn't catching pneumonia on my watch," he said firmly. "I'm fine." As they waited, Hayes outlined his plan: a distraction on the far side of the property, followed by a swift approach to the tool shed while the guards were looking the other way. It was risky, but with the element of surprise, they might have a chance. "What kind of distraction?" Margaret asked. Hayes smiled grimly. "A fire in the hay barn should do nicely. It's far enough from the main buildings that no one innocent will be hurt, but it'll draw their attention." Margaret nodded, fear and determination warring within her. "What do you need me to do?" "Once the distraction is in place, I'll make my way to the tool shed," Hayes explained. "You stay here with the horses, ready to ride. If I'm not back with your father and Daniel within 15 minutes of the fire starting, you ride for town and get the sheriff." "I'm not leaving you," Margaret protested. Hayes took her hands in his. "Margaret, if something goes wrong, someone needs to get help, and," he hesitated, "and someone needs to survive to tell the truth about what Jenkins has done." She wanted to argue further, but the logic of his words stopped her. 15 minutes, not a second longer. The guard change came just after midnight. As the new men settled into position, Hayes prepared to move. He checked his gun one final time, then turned to Margaret. "I love you," he said simply, pulling her close for a brief, fierce kiss. "Remember 15 minutes after the fire starts." Before she could respond, he was gone, slipping silently down the ridge toward the farm buildings below. Margaret watched his progress until he disappeared into the shadows, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give away her position. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she waited. Then, suddenly, an orange glow appeared at the far side of the property. Shouts of alarm rose from the main house, and men began running toward the rapidly spreading fire in the hay barn. Margaret counted silently, watching as most of the guards abandoned their posts to help with the blaze. The 2 men outside the tool shed remained, however, though they were clearly distracted, their attention drawn to the commotion. In the flickering light of the distant fire, she saw a shadow move behind the guards. There was a brief struggle, too far away to see clearly, and then both guards were down. Hayes had made it to the shed. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. 5 minutes. 8. The fire was now fully engaged, the hay barn a roaring inferno that lit up the night sky. Most of Jenkins's men were focused on preventing the flames from spreading to nearby buildings. 10 minutes. 12. Margaret prepared the horses, her muscles tense with the effort of waiting. Just as the 15-minute mark approached, she saw movement near the tool shed. 3 figures emerged, Hayes supporting a limping Thomas Foster and Daniel bringing up the rear. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. As the group made their way toward the ridge, a shout went up from the main house. Jenkins had appeared on the porch, pointing toward the escapees. Margaret wanted to call out a warning, but knew it would only give away her position. She watched in horror as several of Jenkins's men broke away from the fire and started toward Hayes and her family. Hayes saw the danger and urged Foster and Daniel to move faster. They were nearly to the base of the ridge when the first shots rang out. Hayes pushed the other two down behind a small rise, returning fire to cover their retreat. Margaret could wait no longer. Abandoning her post, she led the horses down the ridge, staying low and using the darkness for cover. As she neared their position, she could hear Hayes's voice, urgent and strained. "We're pinned down," he was saying to Foster. "You and Daniel make for the horses when I give the signal. I'll hold them off." "No," Foster argued. "We go together or not at all." Margaret reached them before Hayes could reply. "The horses are just up the slope," she whispered, sliding down beside them. "Are you hurt, Margaret?" Daniel's face lit up at the sight of his sister. "You came for us." "Of course we did," she replied, quickly examining the bloodied bandage on her father's leg. "Can you ride, Pa?" Foster nodded grimly. "It's just a graze. That bastard Jenkins wanted us alive to use as bait." "Which is exactly what you're being," Hayes said tensely, firing again to keep Jenkins's men at bay. "We need to move now while the fire's still got most of their attention." A plan formed in Margaret's mind. "Give me your gun," she said to her father. When he hesitated, she added, "I'm the better shot, and you know it." Foster handed over his revolver. "What are you thinking?" "Hayes and I will provide covering fire from 2 directions," she explained quickly. "You and Daniel make for the horses. We'll follow once you're clear." Hayes started to protest, but Margaret cut him off. "It's the only way, and you know it. One gun isn't enough cover for all 4 of us to escape at once." After a moment's hesitation, Hayes nodded reluctantly. "All right, but at the first sign of trouble, you run. Understand?" Margaret positioned herself behind a fallen log a few yards from their current position, giving her a different angle on Jenkins's men. At Hayes's signal, she began firing, carefully placing her shots to force their attackers to take cover rather than advance. Foster and Daniel made a break for it, scrambling up the slope toward where the horses waited. Jenkins's men, caught in the crossfire, couldn't get a clear shot at them. "They're clear," Hayes called to Margaret. "Your turn. Go." Margaret fired once more, then turned to make her own escape. As she did, she saw a movement to her left, Jenkins himself, approaching from an angle neither she nor Hayes had covered. "Hayes," she screamed in warning. "On your left." Hayes spun just as Jenkins fired. The shot went wide, and Hayes returned fire in one fluid motion. Jenkins staggered but remained standing, raising his gun for another shot. Margaret didn't hesitate. She aimed and pulled the trigger, her bullet finding its mark where Hayes's had missed. Jenkins fell, clutching his chest. "Come on." Hayes grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the slope. Behind them, Jenkins's men had momentarily fallen back, confused by the loss of their leader. They reached the horses to find Foster and Daniel already mounted. "Jenkins?" Foster asked as they swung into their saddles. "Down," Hayes replied shortly. "Might be dead, might not." "We're not staying to find out." They rode hard through the night, taking a circuitous route back to their cabin in case any of Jenkins's men tried to follow. It was nearly dawn when they finally approached the small clearing, exhaustion weighing heavily on all of them. As they dismounted, Margaret noticed her father swaying on his feet. "Pa, how bad is that leg really?" Foster grimaced. "Worse than I let on. The bullet's still in there." Hayes helped the older man into the cabin while Margaret quickly lit lamps and stoked the fire. "Daniel, fetch water from the creek," she instructed her brother. "And the medical kit from my saddlebag." While Daniel ran to obey, Margaret cut away the blood-soaked bandage from her father's leg, revealing an angry wound that was already showing signs of infection. Hayes hissed through his teeth at the sight. "That needs a doctor," he said quietly. "Soon." Foster shook his head wearily. "No time. Jenkins's men will be watching the roads to town, and even if they're not, I'm not sure I'd make the journey." "Then I'll bring the doctor here," Hayes decided. "First light, I'll ride out." "Not alone," Margaret insisted. "It's too dangerous." I'll be faster alone, Hayes argued, and you're needed here. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Everyone froze, Hayes drawing his gun and moving to the window. 3 riders, he reported tensely, coming fast. Daniel joined him at the window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. It's the sheriff, he exclaimed with relief, and Doc Williams and Miss Abernathy. Hayes lowered his gun in surprise as the riders pulled up outside the cabin. Sheriff Miller was the first to dismount, followed by the town doctor and Charlotte. "Quite a night you folks have had," the sheriff remarked as he entered the cabin. "Got word about a fire at Jenkins's place, and then Charlotte here told me you two had gotten married and ridden back here despite warnings." He shook his head. "Figured I'd better come check on you." "Thank God you did," Margaret said, moving aside to let the doctor examine her father. "Pa's been shot." While Dr. Williams tended to Foster's wound, Sheriff Miller took statements from Hayes and Margaret about what had transpired at Jenkins's farm. "Jenkins is dead," the sheriff informed them when they had finished. "Found him with a bullet in his heart. His men are scattered, those that weren't arrested for trying to burn down half the county." "We acted in self-defense," Hayes said firmly. "He took Foster and the boy hostage, shot Foster, and would have killed us all." Miller nodded. "I believe you. And with Foster's wound and the testimony of his men we caught, there won't be any charges. Jenkins had this coming for a long time." Charlotte, who had been helping the doctor with Foster's leg, came to stand beside Margaret. "When you didn't return to town by nightfall, I got worried. Then we heard about the fire." She squeezed Margaret's hand. "Some wedding day you've had, my dear." Margaret glanced at Hayes, who was still discussing details with the sheriff. Despite everything, the danger, the violence, the fear, she couldn't bring herself to regret a moment of it. "It wasn't quite what we planned," she admitted, "but we're together, that's what matters." By mid-morning, Foster's wound had been cleaned and properly bandaged with the bullet removed. The doctor pronounced him out of immediate danger, though he would need rest and careful monitoring to prevent infection. Sheriff Miller prepared to return to town, promising to send word if there was any trouble from the remaining members of Jenkins's crew. "I doubt there will be," he added. "Most of them were hired guns with no personal stake in this fight. With Jenkins gone and no pay forthcoming, they'll move on." After the sheriff and doctor departed, Charlotte announced her intention to stay for a few days to help with Foster's care. "Unless you'd prefer to be alone," she added with a meaningful glance at Hayes and Margaret. "It is, after all, just after your wedding." Margaret blushed but shook her head. "We'd be grateful for your help, Charlotte. There's plenty of work to do here, and with Pa injured." "Then it's settled," Charlotte declared. "Daniel can show me where everything is while you two get some rest. You look dead on your feet, both of you." Hayes, who had been quiet since the sheriff's departure, finally spoke up. "There's something we should discuss first." He looked at Foster. "Jenkins mentioned gold on this property, said that's why he wanted it so badly." Foster raised an eyebrow. "Do you believe him?" "I'm not sure," Hayes admitted. "But Wilson did always seem to have money despite the small scale of his operation here. It might be worth investigating." Daniel, who had been listening intently, bounced with sudden excitement. "I can help look. I know all about prospecting, read a whole book on it at school last year." Foster chuckled weakly from his bed. "Slow down, son. If there is gold, it's been there a while." "It can wait until we're all recovered." Hayes nodded in agreement. "The important thing now is getting this place secure and comfortable. The gold, if it exists, is just a bonus." Margaret felt a surge of love for her new husband. His priorities were clear and true, focused on family and home rather than the lure of potential riches. "We should rest," she said, suddenly feeling the weight of the past day's events. "All of us." As Charlotte shooed them toward the bedroom, insisting she would watch over Foster and keep Daniel occupied, Margaret found herself alone with Hayes for the first time since their hasty wedding. "Not exactly the wedding night I promised you," he said softly, closing the door behind them. "Running from gunfire, digging bullets out of your father." Margaret stepped into his arms, resting her head against his chest. "It was perfect. Perfect." Hayes pulled back to look at her incredulously. "Margaret, we could have been killed, but we weren't," she pointed out. We faced danger together and came through it. We saved my family, and we're here now together." She reached up to touch his face. "I wouldn't change any of it." Hayes's expression softened, his arms tightening around her. "I love you, Margaret O'Malley." "And I love you, Hayes O'Malley," she replied, the name still new and wonderful on her tongue. "Now and always." As he lowered his lips to hers, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead building their home, searching for gold, creating a life together, they would face them as they had faced Jenkins, together with courage and love. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Foster's leg healed slowly but steadily under Charlotte's careful nursing. Hayes, with Daniel's enthusiastic help, began work on expanding the cabin, adding a new room as planned and reinforcing the existing structure. Margaret divided her time between helping with the building, tending the small garden they had started, and exploring the property with an eye toward Jenkins's claims about gold. It was Daniel who made the discovery, nearly a month after the confrontation with Jenkins. He had been exploring the creek where it bent around a rocky outcropping, fascinated by the unusual formation of the stones. "Hayes, Maggie!" His excited shout brought them running. "Look what I found." Hidden behind a natural stone shelf, nearly invisible unless you were specifically searching for it, was a small opening in the rock face just large enough for a man to slip through sideways. A cave, Margaret wondered, peering into the darkness. Hayes fetched a lantern from the cabin, and the three of them ventured inside. The passage widened after a few feet, opening into a small chamber. There they found clear evidence of Wilson's secret, a modest but unmistakable gold vein running through the rock wall, along with simple mining tools and several small leather pouches filled with gold dust and nuggets. "So Jenkins was right," Hayes said softly, holding up one of the pouches. "There was gold here all along." Daniel was practically dancing with excitement. "We're rich, we can buy cattle and horses and—" "Slow down," Margaret laughed, though she too felt the thrill of possibility. "We don't know how much there is yet, and mining takes work, hard work." "Work I'm willing to do," Hayes said, examining the vein with a practiced eye. "This looks promising, but Margaret's right. We shouldn't count our fortunes just yet." When they told Foster about their discovery, he insisted on seeing it for himself, hobbling to the creek with Charlotte's reluctant assistance. Standing in the small cave, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch, he shook his head in wonder. "Old Wilson, you sly dog," he murmured. "No wonder you never worried about drought years." In the months that followed, Hayes worked the small mine carefully, extracting enough gold to purchase a modest herd of cattle and make further improvements to the cabin. Foster, once fully recovered, proved to have a knack for assaying the ore, determining which parts of the vein were worth pursuing. By the following spring, their homestead had transformed. The cabin boasted 3 proper bedrooms now, with a comfortable main room and a covered porch where they gathered in the evenings. A small herd of cattle grazed on the rich grass near the creek, and Margaret's garden flourished in the fertile soil. Charlotte Abernathy, who had remained a frequent visitor, arrived one sunny afternoon with news from town. "The last of Jenkins's men left the county," she reported as they sat on the porch drinking coffee. "Sheriff Miller says the Foster farm, or Jenkins's place, as it has been purchased by a family from back east. Seems they plan to raise horses." "Good," Foster said firmly. "That land deserves a decent family after all it's seen." Margaret, who had been unusually quiet that day, placed her cup carefully on the small table Hayes had built. "I have some news as well," she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Hayes looked at her inquiringly, noting the glow in her cheeks that had been present for several days now. "It seems," Margaret continued, her eyes finding her husband's, "that we'll need to consider adding another room to the cabin by winter." Hayes's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization. "Margaret, are you saying—" She nodded, her smile broadening. "Dr. Williams confirmed it yesterday when I went into town. We're going to have a baby." The porch erupted in excited congratulations, Foster embracing his daughter with tears in his eyes. Daniel peppering her with questions about whether it would be a boy or girl, Charlotte immediately beginning to list all the things they would need to prepare. Hayes sat stunned for a moment, overwhelmed by emotion. Then he rose, gently pulling Margaret to her feet and into his arms. "A baby," he whispered, pressing his forehead to hers. "Our baby. Are you happy?" she asked softly, though she could see the answer in his shining eyes. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "When I rode into Durango a year ago, I was just looking for work, somewhere to settle for a season before moving on. I never imagined I'd find a home, a family." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "A future?" That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Margaret nestled against Hayes's side, his hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked sleepily. "How differently things might have turned out if my father hadn't made that promise to Jenkins." Hayes was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her hip. "Sometimes," he admitted. "If he hadn't, I might never have found the courage to tell you how I felt. I might have just kept working at the Anderson Ranch, watching you from afar, too afraid of rejection to speak up." Margaret turned to face him, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "I would have found a way to let you know. Even then, I think I knew you were the one I was meant to be with." Hayes smiled in the darkness. "You did stand up to Jenkins like a wildcat that day. I choose Hayes, you said, bold as brass." "And I would choose you again," she replied softly, "every day for the rest of our lives." Outside, the creek murmured its endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. Inside the sturdy cabin, built with love and strengthened by shared trials, Hayes and Margaret O'Malley held each other close, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together, not because of a promise made by someone else, but because of the promise they had made to each other. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, their daughter was born, a healthy, strong, lunged little girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. They named her Elizabeth Charlotte O'Malley, though Hayes took to calling her Little Wildcat when he thought Margaret wasn't listening. As Margaret sat on the porch one evening, watching Hayes show their 3-month-old daughter the sunset, Daniel playing with the new puppy Foster had brought home, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the fear and desperation of her father's bargain with Jenkins to the peace and prosperity of their current life, a path marked by courage, love, and the power of choosing one's own destiny. "What are you thinking about, so serious over there?" Hayes asked, bringing Elizabeth over to her mother. Margaret smiled, taking their daughter in her arms. "Just that sometimes the worst promises lead to the best outcomes if you're brave enough to break them." Hayes sat beside her, his arms slipping around her shoulders as they watched the sun sink below the mountains. "Promise yourself to me now," he murmured, echoing his words from that fateful day. Margaret leaned into his embrace, their daughter nestled between them. "I did," she replied simply, "and I always will."